Госпожа председатель.
Madam President, we thank Deputy Special Envoy Najat Rashdi and Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs Martin Griffiths for their briefings and their assessments of the political and humanitarian situation in Syria. We are convinced that there is no alternative to advancing the political settlement process in Syria, which is led and carried out by Syrians themselves with UN assistance in strict compliance with Security Council Resolution 2254 and respect for the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the country. This statement, as well as our consistent position in support of the Special Envoy's mediations efforts, were reaffirmed during consultations with Mr. Peterson in Moscow on June 9th of this year. At the same time, we considered it important for him to strictly adhere to the mandate contained in relevant council decisions, which is centered on the promotion of inter-Syrian negotiations, including within the framework of the Constitutional Committee, as the optimal format for a direct inter-Syrian dialogue. We continue to believe that fundamental decisions on the parameters and the venue for further rounds of inter-Syrian consultations should be made by Syrians themselves without external interference. We note with satisfaction the outcomes of the 20th International Meeting on Syria in Astana held with our partners in the Astana process, Iran and Turkey, on June 20th and 21st. During that meeting, the leading role of the Astana format in promoting a sustainable and long-term settlement of the Syrian crisis was once again underscored. In addition, fruitful quadripartite consultations were held in Astana between the deputy foreign ministers of Russia, Iran, Syria, and Turkey on the preparation of a roadmap for restoring Syrian-Turkish relations. Madam President, international attention is focused on the normalization of relations between Damascus and the Arab countries, including the long-awaited return of Syria to the Arab League. We believe that the resumption of Syria's participation in the work of the LAS, of which it is one of the founding states, will continue contributing to the improvement of the atmosphere in the Middle East and overcoming the consequences of this Syrian crisis, as well as the catastrophic earthquake of February 6 as soon as possible. In this context, we hope that Arab states will step up their support for the Syrian Arab Republic to assist in rebuilding its infrastructure with an emphasis on the humanitarian and trade and economic spheres. This effort is complicated by the illegitimate unilateral sanctions in effect against Damascus and introduced by Western states. Unable to prevent the return of Syria into the Arab family, our American and European colleagues are trying to bargain with Damascus for unilateral political concessions while continuing to espouse anti-Damascus attitudes. We are hearing about plans to adopt an Anti-Assad Normalization Act, which shows that the U.S. is not ready to abandon its neo-colonial approaches and its policy of punishing the Syrian people and leadership for carrying out an independent policy. To this end, they employ such practical tools as the Caesar Act, illegal military presence in Trans-Euphrates and Al-Tanf, the plunder of Syrian natural resources, oil and grain, declarations made by Washington and Brussels about easing sanctions and the generosity of Western donors, including after the earthquake, have in reality turned out to be mere empty words. In this context, the situation on the ground remains tense. The destabilizing factors remain the same: illegal foreign presence in the north, northeast, and south of the country, persistent hotbeds of terrorism, primarily in Idlib, regular arbitrary Israeli airstrikes on Syrian territory. Such actions, which violate the sovereignty of Syria and neighboring Arab states, as well as the lack of any proper response from UN leadership, are cause for deep regret and condemnation. For our part, we are working side by side with the Syrian army to continue fighting the terrorists who have become entrenched in Idlib. On June 25th, the Syrian armed forces, together with the Russian aerospace forces, destroyed a command post operating in this province under the umbrella of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the Al-Fat al-Mubin terrorist alliance. They also destroyed warehouses with weapons and ammunition and facilities for equipping UAVs with explosives and launching them. More than 30 militants were eliminated, including several jihadist leaders. Madam President, in the context of the humanitarian problems in Syria, we note the lack of progress in the implementation of the Cross-Border Security Council Resolution 2672. Even the devastating February earthquake did not change the state of affairs. We are particularly concerned about the deplorable funding for UN operations in the country. Donors' full attention has been focused exclusively on the areas of the northwest not controlled by Damascus. The emergency humanitarian appeal, in which the UN requested $397 million to assist affected areas, was fully funded in just the first months. The same cannot be said for the UN humanitarian country plan for Syria for 2023. Out of $5.4 billion, only 12% of the funds have been collected by the middle of the year. Given the acute shortage of WFP funding, next month the program will be forced to reduce its coverage by 40%. They are trying to convince us that the cross-border mechanism should be extended for 12 months in order to better plan operations. Let us ask the question, what means will the UN be using to plan these operations? So these calls that we will hear today are simply hypocritical. In this context, it is impossible to even talk about early recovering projects. Against this context, the so-called generosity of Western donors in relation to the crisis in Ukraine, which provoked they themselves, appears duplicitous. As soon as the conversation turns to Syria, Yemen, and African countries, our Western colleagues either don't have money or they allocate it extremely reluctantly and in small amounts. On the other hand, the U.S. and its allies have already spent the same amount just on weapons in Ukraine as OCHA requested in 2023 to provide humanitarian assistance to all those in need around the entire world, about $55 billion US. Incidentally, to date, OCHA has received only 20% of this amount. Imagine how many people around the world could be helped if Western donors truly wanted to do so. But no, it's more important for them to spend more money on weapons, as a result of which their own weapons companies can enrich themselves. The total amount of financial, military, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, according to that country's national bank, exceeded $120 billion US in 2022 alone. This lays out Western priorities very clearly. Dear colleagues, in this challenging and not very inspiring context, we will soon once again be deciding on the future of the cross-border mechanism for humanitarian assistance in Syria. In anticipation of this, the hypocritical Western propaganda machine has once again been launched, cleaned of rust by our Western partners once every 6 months. We are once again being told that without the cross-border mechanism, millions of Syrians will starve and freeze, and that there is no other choice except to extend this scheme once again, even though it violates the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria. They say this knowing full well that there is an alternative, deliveries across the contact line provided for by Security Council Resolution 2762, among others. It's just that these are not profitable for the internationally recognized terrorists in Idlib, who in this case would be deprived of the opportunity to plunder humanitarian aid and enrich themselves in the same amounts as they can with the cross-border mechanisms. That is why we only saw one very modest convoy, which was clearly timed to coincide with today's meeting. And do you seriously expect us to consider the situation with cross-line convoys to be satisfactory after this? Over the past 6 months, unilateral U.S. and EU sanctions have not only not been lifted, they have not even been eased, and they continue to strangle those whom we are called upon to help by extending the cross-border mechanism. It's awkward to even mention early recovery projects in the territory controlled by legitimate authorities. Not only are these mere crumbs, they are also implemented with a huge number of restrictions which often do not allow for the actual reconstruction of the facilities themselves. All these appears to be mere smoke and mirrors and an imitation of activity. The opinion widely stated in the Council that the abolition of the cross-border resolution would lead to the refusal of donors to support early recovery efforts in Syria and allegedly deprive the UN of the mandate for early recovery appear unconvincing. This support has barely been enough to cover the basic urgent needs of Syrians all these years. The vast majority of these Syrians live in territories under the control of government forces. the cross-border mechanism in this formula is a zero-sum game from the very beginning, and it does not bring any benefits to the Syrian people. Instead, we are increasingly hearing the UN express a desire to gain a foothold in the rebellious northwest in isolation from engagement with official authorities in Damascus. In this context, our approaches and assessments of the cross-border mechanism have not changed. This mechanism is only nominally humanitarian. In fact, it is more and more being used to undermine the sovereignty and deepen the territorial division of Syria, discriminate against government-controlled territories, and fuel illegal armed groups. And with this approach, the question naturally arises, for whose sake are we, in fact, going to adopt a new resolution on the cross-border mechanism? And it does not seem that this is for the sake of Syrians, but rather for the sake of terrorists who have taken refuge in Idlib. We believe that the time has come for our Western colleagues to change their hypocritical approach if we are truly looking to help the people of Syria and Syrian refugees. In this context, we call on the penholders of the Syrian humanitarian dossier to put the true interests of the long-suffering Syrian people living in the territories under the control of the internationally recognized government of Syria first. They should not get carried away with politicizing humanitarian issues and playing to lose with the UN and the terrorists in Idlib, who have established close and, from what we can tell, mutually beneficial cooperation since February with UN Deputy Regional Humanitarian Coordinator for Syria and, incidentally, a British citizen, David Carden. Thank you for your attention.